The date is April 15, 1941, Fort Benning, Georgia, where the red dust of the training grounds settles slowly on rows of newly issued helmets and unfinished tracks of armored vehicles, and the sound of engines is still unfamiliar to the men who will soon be expected to treat it as second nature. The 4th Armored Division does not yet exist as a combat formation, only as a designation on paper and a collection of officers and enlisted men drawn from across the United States, farmers from the Midwest, mechanics from Detroit, clerks from small towns in Pennsylvania, men with no shared past and no inherited military tradition binding them together. The atmosphere is not one of urgency, but of deliberate construction, as if time itself has been set aside to build something that is not yet needed, but soon will be. No banners are raised, no speeches delivered, only schedules, tables of organization, and a quiet understanding among senior officers that the United States is moving toward a war it has not yet fully acknowledged. The division is formed under the logic of experiment rather than tradition, at a moment when the U.S. Army itself is unsure what an armored force should truly be, torn between infantry doctrine and emerging theories of mechanized warfare observed in Europe. Tanks are still viewed by many as auxiliary tools, not decisive instruments, and the early months are marked by confusion, constant reorganization, and a lack of standardized procedures. Yet this uncertainty becomes an advantage because it creates space for something unusual: prolonged, uninterrupted training. While other units are rushed toward readiness for political reasons, the 4th Armored Division is deliberately held back, cycled through deserts, forests, and swamps, trained in night movement, long-distance marches, rapid repairs, and decentralized decision-making. Exercises are repeated not until they look correct on paper, but until they function under fatigue, confusion, and simulated loss of command. The men are taught early that orders may not arrive, radios may fail, and commanders may be killed or cut off, and that hesitation under such conditions is more dangerous than initiative. Tank crews are rotated through infantry coordination drills, mechanics are trained to fight if necessary, junior officers are placed in situations where they must act without guidance and then defend their decisions afterward. This is not accidental, but intentional, rooted in the belief that modern war will fracture command structures faster than doctrine can compensate. The division becomes a testing ground for a simple principle: every soldier must understand the mission well enough to continue it alone. By late 1942, as other formations prepare for overseas deployment, the 4th Armored Division remains in training, accumulating something invisible but decisive: cohesion built under stress rather than ceremony, and confidence born not from slogans but from repetition. To outside observers, it appears delayed, even underutilized. Inside the division, however, a different understanding takes hold. When the moment comes, there will be no time to learn. The war will demand immediate action, and only those already conditioned to act without instruction will survive what follows. By the spring of 1942, the center of gravity within the division shifts quietly but decisively to one man: John Shirley Wood, 41 years old, a career officer whose reputation is not built on public charisma or political connections, but on an unusual combination of intellectual rigor and impatience with inertia. Wood is not interested in symbols of command. He is interested in systems that function under pressure. A graduate of West Point, a veteran of the First World War, and a student of foreign military doctrine, he arrives at the 4th Armored Division with a clear conviction that modern mechanized warfare cannot be controlled exclusively from the top, because speed itself destroys centralized authority. Wood studies German operational methods not as an admirer, but as an analyst, stripping them of ideological framing and reducing them to functional principles: tempo, initiative, and the ruthless exploitation of opportunity. Yet he rejects blind imitation. Where German doctrine depends heavily on rigid hierarchy masked by aggressive execution, Wood seeks something different: an internal culture where responsibility flows downward and accountability flows upward. He repeatedly states in staff conferences and informal briefings that a commander who cannot explain his decision to a subordinate has not understood it himself. Orders are therefore short, precise, and limited to intent rather than method, forcing junior officers to think rather than comply mechanically. Under Wood's leadership, the division is treated explicitly as a living organism rather than a sum of battalions. Maintenance, logistics, reconnaissance, and combat arms are trained together, not sequentially, because Wood understands that speed is not produced by tanks alone, but by the elimination of friction between functions. Staff officers are required to spend time in line units. Tank commanders are forced to plan supply movements, and after-action reviews focus less on outcomes than on decision-making processes under uncertainty. Mistakes are documented, not punished, unless they result from hesitation or failure to act. Wood's intolerance is reserved for slowness, not error. He dismisses officers who wait for perfect information, believing that such men are more dangerous than those who act imperfectly but decisively. This philosophy permeates the division gradually, without slogans, reinforced through repetition rather than instruction. Over time, officers internalize an unspoken rule. If contact is made with the enemy, action must follow immediately, even if the action later proves suboptimal. By the end of training, the division no longer depends on Wood's direct presence to function as intended. That is his deliberate design. When the division eventually enters combat, it will do so dispersed, confused, and under pressure, exactly the conditions Wood has been preparing for. What remains untested is whether this theoretical organism can survive first contact with reality, where doctrine is irrelevant and only reactions matter. July 1944, Normandy, a landscape already exhausted by weeks of bombardment, where hedgerows block vision, movement, and radio signals alike, and the smell of burned fuel mixes with wet earth under constant artillery fire. When the 4th Armored Division finally enters combat, it does so not as a dramatic arrival, but as a calculated insertion into an already unstable front, where infantry units are pinned, supply routes are strained, and German defenses, though damaged, remain lethal. The men experience their first casualties not in sweeping maneuvers, but in narrow lanes, under indirect fire, where tanks cannot see the enemy that is killing them. There is no clean opening, only friction, noise, and partial information. What becomes immediately visible to observers is not tactical brilliance, but behavioral difference. Tank crews maneuver without waiting for detailed instructions, platoon leaders reroute columns instinctively when roads are blocked, and junior officers commit forces on their own authority when fleeting opportunities appear. These actions do not always produce perfect results, and losses occur, but the division does not stall. Training reveals its true value not in success, but in continuity of action under disruption. When radios fail, movement continues. When senior officers are delayed or cut off, subordinate units do not halt in uncertainty. During Operation Cobra, the theoretical system designed in training is exposed fully to operational reality. After the massive aerial bombardment fractures German lines, gaps appear not as clearly defined corridors, but as brief windows measured in minutes rather than hours. The division moves immediately, not because orders demand it, but because its internal logic recognizes momentum as perishable. Columns advance through smoke and debris, bypassing resistance when necessary, isolating enemy units rather than destroying them outright, prioritizing depth over cleanliness. Speed compensates for incomplete information, exactly as Wood's doctrine had predicted. The division's early after-action reports reveal a pattern. Casualties are sustained, but units rarely become encircled or immobilized. German counterattacks strike empty positions or arrive too late to cut supply lines effectively. The absence of prolonged halts frustrates enemy attempts to regain coherence. In several engagements, German commanders later report uncertainty about the division's actual strength, mistaking its constant movement for numerical superiority. By the end of the Normandy fighting, the division is no longer experimental. It has demonstrated that training designed around initiative rather than compliance produces measurable operational effects. The battlefield has validated the theory, but only partially. Ahead lies a different test, against a reorganized enemy equipped with superior armor and operating under conditions where speed alone may no longer suffice, and where the margin for error will shrink even further. September 19, 1944, Lorraine, near the village of Aricourt, where morning fog lies thick over open fields and shallow ridgelines, compressing visibility to a few hundred meters and turning distance into uncertainty. The terrain appears deceptively favorable for armored combat, yet the conditions negate optics, long-range fire, and carefully prepared plans. It is here that the 4th Armored Division encounters a reorganized German force equipped with Panther and Tiger tanks, vehicles whose armor and guns are, on paper, decisively superior to the American M4 Sherman. The engagement that follows is not a set-piece battle, but a series of fragmented collisions shaped by weather, initiative, and reaction time. German forces intend to exploit technical advantage through deliberate counterattack, expecting American units to slow, consolidate, and defend. Instead, they encounter formations that refuse to behave predictably. The division advances in dispersed elements, probing constantly, shifting axes of movement without waiting for full situational clarity. Fog erases long-range superiority, forcing combat into close, chaotic encounters where reaction speed and coordination matter more than armor thickness. American tank crews fire first, maneuver aggressively, and disengage before German units can mass firepower effectively. A central figure emerges during these engagements, Creighton Abrams, then a battalion commander, whose approach reflects the division's culture in distilled form. Abrams positions his tanks forward, not to absorb attack, but to disrupt German timing. He commits quickly, withdraws decisively, and re-enters from unexpected directions, denying the enemy the stable contact necessary to exploit technical superiority. His decisions are not exceptional within the division, they are representative. What distinguishes them is consistency under pressure. Over several days, German armored units repeatedly attempt to concentrate forces, only to find themselves engaged piecemeal, flanked, or bypassed. American artillery, directed rapidly and often by forward observers embedded with tank units, compensates for weaknesses in direct fire. Logistics units keep pace, enabling sustained movement without pauses that would allow German regrouping. The result is asymmetrical. German losses mount despite material superiority, while American units maintain operational cohesion. Post-battle analysis reveals the essential factor. Aricourt is not won through superior machines or numerical dominance, but through a command culture that treats uncertainty as a condition to be exploited rather than feared. The fog that blinds German optics becomes an ally to American maneuver. By the time visibility improves, the initiative has already shifted irreversibly. The battle confirms that the division's effectiveness is not situational but structural. Yet the next challenge will test not flexibility but endurance, under conditions where speed alone may no longer be enough, and where the cost of hesitation will be measured in encirclement and collapse. December 18, 1944, the Ardennes, where winter arrives not as a background condition, but as an active force, freezing fuel lines, slowing engines, and erasing roads beneath snow and ice. The German offensive has ruptured the Allied front, creating confusion measured in hours rather than days, and entire formations are suddenly without clear flanks or rear areas. Orders are fragmentary, maps obsolete, and intelligence contradictory. Into this disorder, the 4th Armored Division is redirected abruptly, ordered to abandon its current axis and move north toward Bastogne, where American airborne forces are surrounded, and time is no longer an abstract variable. The movement itself becomes a test of institutional resilience.
Units march through snow-covered roads under constant threat of air attack and ambush, often advancing at night to preserve momentum. Fuel shortages force commanders to choose which columns move and which wait, decisions made locally without confirmation from higher headquarters. Vehicles break down, crews improvise repairs in sub-zero temperatures, and infantry rides exposed on tank decks for hours, conserving strength for combat rather than comfort. The division does not advance as a single mass, but as overlapping thrusts, each designed to maintain pressure even if others stall. German defenses around Bastogne are layered and deliberate, anchored in villages turned into strongpoints, and reinforced by experienced units expecting a cautious American approach. Instead, they face continuous probing attacks that refuse to disengage. When one route is blocked, another is attempted immediately. Tank infantry teams assault fortified positions without extended preparation, relying on speed and surprise rather than overwhelming firepower. Losses are sustained, but momentum is preserved, which becomes the division's primary operational objective. On December 26th, the forward elements reach the outskirts of Bastogne. The breakthrough is not dramatic, not a sweeping collapse of German lines, but a narrow corridor forced open through persistent pressure. The link-up itself is almost understated, marked more by exhaustion than celebration. Yet its significance is decisive. The siege is broken, not by a single heroic action, but by the accumulated effect of countless local decisions executed under extreme stress without awaiting permission. In the aftermath, reports emphasize not bravery, which is assumed, but reliability under collapse. The division has functioned in conditions where centralized control is largely theoretical. What becomes clear is that the system built in training has now been tested at its limits and has not failed. Ahead lies the final phase of the war, where resistance will harden even as defeat becomes inevitable, and where the consequences of this operational culture will be fully revealed.
February-May 1945, Western Germany, where the front no longer resembles a continuous line, but a collapsing structure, fragmented by breakthroughs, refugee flows, and the systematic disintegration of German command authority. For the 4th Armored Division, the final phase of the war is not a pursuit in the romantic sense, but a sequence of rapid advances punctuated by sudden resistance, improvised crossings, and encounters with realities for which no tactical manual offers guidance. Towns fall quickly, bridges are seized before demolition, and German units surrender in clusters, often without firing, while others fight briefly and then dissolve. Speed remains decisive, but now it serves not to penetrate a coherent defense, but to prevent the enemy from reforming one. As the division advances deeper into Germany, it encounters concentration camps and forced labor sites, scenes that impose a different kind of operational pause, not dictated by enemy action, but by moral shock and logistical necessity. Reports become clinical again, documenting locations, numbers, and conditions, while units continue moving forward with minimal delay. The division's internal discipline proves critical here as well, preventing collapse into disorder or uncontrolled retaliation. Commanders insist on procedure, even as the context exceeds anything previously encountered. By the time hostilities cease, the statistical record of the division appears anomalous. Combat losses are significant, but proportionally lower than comparable armored formations, given the tempo of operations. Even more striking is the near absence of large numbers of permanent prisoners of war taken from within the division itself. Units are rarely surrounded, and when contact becomes unfavorable, disengagement occurs early and decisively. This is not explained by luck alone. It is the cumulative effect of a culture that treats encirclement as a failure of initiative long before it becomes a tactical reality. Post-war analysis strips away mythology and focuses on structure. The division's effectiveness does not correlate directly with equipment, which remains largely standard, nor with numerical superiority, which it rarely possesses at decisive moments. Instead, its performance aligns consistently with three factors: prolonged pre-war training that conditioned autonomous action, a command philosophy that rewarded initiative over compliance, and an operational doctrine that treated speed as a form of protection rather than mere aggression. The division functions as a system designed to absorb uncertainty without freezing. The final conclusion is therefore unambiguous. The combat record of the 4th Armored Division demonstrates that military effectiveness is not primarily a product of technology, but of organizational culture. When soldiers are trained to understand intent rather than await orders, when commanders accept responsibility for action rather than permission, and when cohesion is built before combat rather than demanded during it, outcomes emerge that appear statistically improbable. The war ends not with a single decisive moment, but with confirmation that preparation, trust, and discipline have quietly determined the result long before the final shots are fired.